about when we're supposed to italicize a title versus when we're supposed to simply enclose the title within quotation marks, we're going to talk about the inside it rule. What I mean by the inside it rule is if the title is for something usually found inside a bigger work, then we put the title inside quotation marks. So an example of this that you would identify with really easily is a song. A song is typically published, on an entire album. That one song is inside the entire album, so that song's title is inside quotation marks. The album, though, is its own thing. You would go to the store and you would buy that album. And maybe it comes in, an entire set of CDs or something, but it can be sold on its own. It's a complete thing, the entire album. Now, because of that, it's not inside something else, so it doesn't go inside quotation marks. It's simply italicized. That's one example of the inside it rule. All right, to clarify this a little bit more, let's just go over a list of the types of titles that you typically would italicize. So these are all things that would be published on their own, like novels, plays, pieces of art, like paintings and sculptures, the names of ships, a TV series, music albums, magazines, and newspapers. All right, so all of these things are complete on their own. As far as a play is concerned, yes, plays, movies, they're definitely shorter than an entire novel would be, but they're printed on their own. You could go to the bookstore and you could buy a script, and that is complete on its own, published on its own. It is therefore italicized. When it comes to a TV series, then that is the complete work, like Star Trek or whatever TV show you would prefer to watch. But the series itself is italicized. We'll talk about the episodes later because they are inside the series, so they follow the inside it rule. When it comes to music and albums, the entire album is italicized. The individual songs are inside the album. Those would actually just be inside quotation marks. When it comes to magazines and newspapers, the title of the magazine, like National Geographic, that whole piece, that is italicized. But when you get down to the articles within it, like Who Rules the Forest, this article is inside the magazine, so the title goes inside quotation marks. The full work, italicized. The article inside it, inside quotation marks. And it's the same thing with newspapers. So, for example, Fort Worth Star-Telegram would be italicized, but if you were citing an article on the front page of the newspaper, well, the title of the article would be inside quotation marks. Again, this just follows that simple, really easy rule, the inside it rule. If it's published inside something else, then it's inside quotation marks. Sometimes that rule feels a little bit strange, like in this instance, Dr. Seuss's ABCs. What do you think? It's really short. It's italicized because it's the complete work. Okay, so even though it's really short, it's not a lot of pages, it is complete in this form. It does not have to be inside something else in order to be published. It is, even though it's a children's book, italicized. Okay, now, some things that follow that inside it rule that we've not mentioned yet, but you need to be aware of. Things like short stories and poems and essays. Let's talk about those for a moment. No matter how famous a poem is, you wouldn't go to Barnes & Noble and say, hey, can I buy a copy of this poem? And they give you a sheet of paper, and you go and you buy your sheet of paper. Poems are published almost always within anthologies. An anthology is very heavy. An anthology is a collection of works. Poems, short stories, you name it. It is collected within an anthology. And they don't have to be as big as this one. This is a rather impressive looking anthology. But the poem is not published by itself. It's published inside another book. So going back and explaining the Inside It rule again, the title of the anthology, The Bedford Introduction to Literature, that is italicized. But the poem within it, or the short story within it, the Cask of Amontillado, for instance, that would be inside quotation marks because it's printed inside the anthology. All right. Back to songs and TV episodes. The song is inside the album, so it's inside quotation marks. And the episode of a TV show, well, that's inside the series. So the individual episode itself, that title is inside quotation marks. Speeches. Almost always, a speech is treated like an essay is treated. And that means it's inside quotation marks. Again, you don't go and just buy a copy of a speech. The speech is usually printed in an anthology or, a collection of works. So it still follows that. Now, there are exceptions with speeches because there are a few speeches, such as the Gettysburg Address, which are considered so incredibly significant, so recognizable, that we actually would italicize the Gettysburg Address. Those exceptions are very rare. Another exception that we have deals with poetry. Some poems we know are book length. An epic poem, let's say the Odyssey. Well, the Odyssey, you can go to Barnes & Noble and you can buy just a copy of the Odyssey. It doesn't have to be printed within something else like most poetry does. So in the case of these book-length poems, they actually are italicized. They're treated like books or novels in that instance. When it comes to the names of ships and artwork, those are, again, complete pieces. So it's easy still to recognize, okay, these things need to be italicized. As far as the rule goes with pieces of art, again, that's a painting, that's a sculpture. It's any piece of art that has been named. I realize that you won't always see it printed this way, particularly in newspapers and online. So we have just a couple more questions to resolve about italicizing titles or setting titles within quotation marks. First of all, is there ever an instance where you can choose and it's okay to italicize, but it's also okay to use quotation marks? The answer is yes. And the time whenever you can choose, and you're right, no matter which way you do it, is if you're referring to a word as a word. For instance, if you wrote something along the lines of, I'm certain the word she used was devastated. That is what she said. Well, the word devastated is being referred to as a word. It's not just part of the conversation. It's not just part of the writing. It's a word referred to as a word. And in that instance, it's okay to simply set it off within quotation marks, but it's also okay to set that off by italicizing it. A guideline about this, though, is if you have many instances of referring to a word as a word, that using lots of quotation marks like that has a very cluttered look to it, and readers would prefer that the writer use an italicized format instead. And then that leaves us with this question to resolve. What about underlining? Don't we sometimes do that with titles too? Well, the answer to that is extremely simple. Underlining is only for when you're writing by hand. Originally, underlining was like italicizing, but with the advent of word processors that can actually italicize things for us, and it looks so splendid, there's no longer any need for underlining when typing, and it shouldn't be done at all when typing. The only time you should ever even think about underlining is if you have a piece of paper and a pencil and you're writing in that fashion. And then all the rules that apply to italicizing just transfer over to underlining. It accomplishes the same thing. It's simply that italicizing is for typing, word processing, and underlining is for